Hello and welcome back. In this video, I want to talk about if statements, one of the most fundamental blocks, not just in Python, but in all programming languages. So let's dive in. But before we dive in, what is it really the problem that we're trying to solve here? The problem is as follows. If you look at all of the code that we've written so far, it's executed in a sequential manner, meaning that the Python interpreter will execute the first statement, finish the execution of the first statement, and then go on to the second one, execute it, third one, and so on and so forth. So for example, if we look at the code right here, and we want to track how this code will be executed, the first thing that the Python interpreter will do is to assign the value of 5 to the variable x. And then it moves on to the second statement and assigns the value of 10 to the variable y. The third statement, you're just going to print x is, and then the value of x, which is 5. And then the last statement, it will be y is, and then the value of y is 10. So as you can see, Python just executes the first statement, second, third, and fourth, sequentially. That's good, reasonable, and logical, but it doesn't really solve all of the different types of problems that we're going to face. It's very limited in what it can do. And why is that? For example, think about the following scenario. Let's say you go to a website, netflix.com, for example. Once you go to this website, there will be a check on whether you are logged in with a username or password or you're not logged in. If you're logged in, you're going to be faced with some screen that probably has some movies that are recommended for you, some shows, and so on and so forth. If you're not logged in, you're going to see a different screen, which, just a screen for you to either register, sign up for the service, or log in. So what happens here is there is a check and there is a condition that needs to be met for you to see a certain page. If this condition is met, if you are logged in, then you're going to see a specific screen. If you're not logged in, you're going to see a different screen. With this sequential model of execution, you cannot really do this. We need to have a little bit more control over the flow of execution. We want to branch out of this sequential execution of statements. And how do we do that? This is what if statements does. So let's see how we can do something similar using if statements. Okay, say instead of just printing x and printing y, say we want to print x only if the value of x is larger than 7. This is what we want to do. So if x is 8, 9, anything larger than 7, then we're going to print it on the screen. If the value of x is less than 7, we're not going to print it out on the screen. Okay? But regardless, we want to print y. If you want to write the code for this, it will look like this. First, we say x is equal to 5 and y is equal to 10. And here, this is how the if statement looks like. So this is our if statement. And what I want to do now is I want to talk deeper about what the if statement is. So the first thing here is the keyword if, and this is what you need to type if you want to tell Python that you are starting an if statement. So you say if. Okay. After if, there's something here which says x is greater than 7. So this is what we call a condition. A condition. And we're going to talk about what a condition is. And then another thing here that I want you to notice is the colon. So we have a colon, and the colon is something that we're going to use a lot, not just in if statements, but later when we talk about loops and many other things. The colon is very widely used in the Python programming language. And then underneath the colon, there are actually two things I want you to notice. The first thing is we have some sort of indentation here. Indentation. And then after the indentation, we have the statement that we want to execute if the condition is true. So let's go back to what the condition is. Condition is any expression that evaluates to true or false. And we talked about Boolean data types before, so I'm assuming you understand what true and false mean. If you don't know, you have to go back and watch the Boolean data types because it's essential to understand Boolean data before you understand this lesson, okay? All right, so a condition again is anything that eventually evaluates to either true or false. In this case, what we have is x is greater than 7. X is greater than 7 is a comparison operation, and we talked about comparison operations before as well. And we also said that the comparison operation always evaluates to either true or false. So in this case, x is greater than 7, x is equal to 5, 5 is not greater than 7. So this condition evaluates to false. And then after the condition, we have the colon. We talked about this, and this basically tells Python that this is when the if statement body is going to start. So in this case, the if statement body is this whole statement. Is the statement or statements that we want to execute if the if condition is evaluated to true. So all of this, we call this the if body. Okay, so the if body are the statements that are going to be executed if the condition is evaluated to true. So what happens if the condition is evaluated to false? Well, the if body is not going to be executed. And in this particular example, the if body is just one statement only. Now, someone can ask, what is the purpose of the indentation? Why do we need an indentation here? The indentation is a way to tell Python that this particular group of statements, in this case, it's just one statement, but in general, you can have more than one statement, and we're going to see how. They belong to the same block of code. And this is also a way for Python to separate between what is the if body and what is the rest of the program. For example, without this indentation, how would Python know that the print y is not part of the if body? There would be no way for Python to know that, okay? Python will know what the if body is, what are the statements that needs to be executed if the condition is true, from this indentation. So if we want to trace this program and see what the output is going to be, so we start by x is equal to 5, y is equal to 10, and then the if statement starts is x greater than 7. This condition evaluates to false, so this print statement is not going to be executed. However, this print statement for y is going to be executed. So we're going to say y is, and then the value of y is 10. So the output of this program will be y is 10. But what I want you to understand here is the syntax of the if statement. Like I said, you start with an if, and then there is a condition, there is a colon, there is an indentation, and then there is the body of the if statement. Once you get and understand these concepts well, then everything will be easy. Let's take another example. Let's now see how we can write an if statement with multiple lines in the if body. Let's take a look at the code here. We start by saying x is equal to 5, y is equal to 10, and then the same if statement that we had before, if x is greater than 7. Now we want to do two things. We want to print x is larger than 7, and we also want to print x is, and then the value of x. And then after the if statement is done, we print y is, and then the value of y. So this is very similar to the last example. The reason why I'm showing you this is I want you to look at how we define the if body here when we have more than one statement inside the if body. So all of this is one block of code. So this is called a code block. And all of this will be executed if the condition evaluates to true. So in this case, all this thing over here is our if statement. And I want you to also notice the indentation, that you have an indentation here, and then you have another indentation here. Because both of these statements belong to the same block, to the same code block that you want to be executed if the if condition evaluates to true. All right, let's actually run this program and see what we get. But before we run it, think for a second, what is the output is going to be? Well, here the if statement, we have x is greater than 7, which is not true. It evaluates to false. And that means that these statements are not going to be executed. The only statement that is going to be executed, or let me say the only print statement that is going to be executed is this print statement in line number 6. So if we run our program now, we can see that we get y is and then the value of y, which is equal to 10. But what if we change the value of x, say from 5 to 25? Now what's going to happen is 25 is greater than 7, so both of these statements are going to be executed, and then the statement here in line number 6 is also going to be executed. So if we run our program now, that's the output that we expect, and that's the output that we get. Now, like I said, indentation is extremely important in Python because this is what tells Python that these two statements belong to the same block of code. What happens if they have different indentations? For example, here the indentation that we have is 4 spaces, and here the indentation is also 4 spaces. In this case, we're using 4 spaces, but what if we increase the indentation here to, let's say, 6 spaces, and we run our program again? Let's look at what we get. So we get an error. This is a very important thing to understand what the error messages are. It says that there is an unexpected indent in line number 5, which is true. Because when you're trying to represent a block of code, this block of code needs to have the same indentation, the exact same indentation. And since this is not the case here, Python returns an error. And similarly, if we remove all indentations, so we take these back, and if we run our program again, you can see that Python is expecting an indented block, which is the indentation needed for the if body. Okay, but since we don't have it, that's why we get an error. So I just wanted to show you some of the errors that you might get that are related to indentation, so that if you see them, you'll be able to debug what the issue is and kind of solve the problem quickly. Okay, now that we understand what an if statement is, I want to move on to something similar to the if statement, but it's called if-else statement. What does the if-else statement do? So the if-else statement behaves very similarly to the if statement. But remember, when we talked about the if statement, there was a condition. And if this condition evaluates to true, a block of code will be executed, right? If the if statement or the if condition is evaluated to false, that block is not going to be executed. But what if what I really want to do is I want to look at the condition, and if the condition is evaluated to true, I want a block of code to be executed. But if the condition is evaluated to false, I want a different block of code to be executed. For example, if we look at the code here, we have a value that represents the grade for, let's say, a student. And if this grade is greater than or equal to 50, I want to print pass on the screen. If not, I want to print fail on the screen. So in other words, I want to look at the condition here, and if the condition evaluates to true, then this is the block of code that I want to execute. But if the condition evaluates to false, then I want this block of code to be executed. To do this using the if-else statement, it's pretty easy. It's similar to the if statement, but then you add this else. And then you also add the colon. And you add the indentation under the else. And the block of code under the else is going to be the block of code that is to be executed if the if condition evaluates to false. And since a condition will either evaluate to true or false, there's no third value for a Boolean expression, then either the block of code under the if statement or the block of code under the else statement is going to be executed. There's no way none of them will be executed, and there's no way both of them will be executed. This is critical. So as you go through this code and you look at this if-else statement, you know for sure that one of the two blocks of code are going to be executed. In this example, grade is 90. 90 is greater than or equal to 50, then this means that pass will be printed on the screen. And this statement right here is not going to be executed. What if grade is, let's say, 35? Then you're going to go down, the Python interpreter will be executing your code, check the condition. Grade is not greater than 50, which means that this block of code right here is not going to be executed, but this one is going to be executed. So what's going to be printed on the screen? You're going to see fail printed on the screen. So this is simply what an if-else statement is. If you understand what an if statement is, understanding this will be very, very simple. All right, let's move on. Okay, so now we know how to write an if statement, and we know how to write an if-else statement. Let's say what we want to do here is, instead of just printing pass or fail based on the value of the grade variable, what we want to do is we want to do something like this. If the grade is greater than 90, we want to print A. If the grade is between 80 and 90, we print B. If it's between 70 and 80, we print C, and so on and so forth. So we're still printing out the grade based on the value of grade, but it's not pass or fail. It's more granular than that. And this is slightly different than the if-else statement, because the if-else statement, if you can remember, there was a condition, and if this condition evaluates to true, we execute a block of code. If it evaluates to false, we execute a different block of code. So there was just only two ways. Here we have a multi-way if statement. There is one of many different blocks that can be executed. Let's look at this code and see what's going to happen. So first we start by saying grade is equal to 74. And then all of this is our if-else statement. Notice that I say else if, but the way you actually write it in your code is ELIF, but it's really an else if statement. In other programming languages, you actually type else if. But anyways, notice that we have one if, many else if, and then one else. So let's start. The first thing is this condition right here. Is grade greater than or equal to 90? This condition evaluates to false. What does that mean? What does that mean when the condition evaluates to false? It means that this block of code is not going to be executed. Then what do? We move on to the second else if statement. So we come here to the else if statement and we look, is grade greater than or equal to 80? This also evaluates to false, which means that this is not going to be executed. Let's go to the third else if statement. Is grade greater than or equal to 70? This one evaluates to true. So what does that mean? It means that we are going to print C on the screen. So if this is the output, C will be printed on the screen. But then what's going to happen next? That's the most important part. Once a condition is evaluated to true in an if-else-if-else statement, you're done. You don't really look into the other statements. So for example, this one here and this one here, these are not going to even be looked at. Despite the fact that if you actually look at it, so if you look at this one, is grade greater than or equal to 60? That actually evaluates to true as well, right? However, this statement right here is not going to be executed. And why is that? It's because when you have an if-elif-else statement, the first if or else if condition that evaluates to true is the one whose block is going to be executed. All the other ones are not going to be looked at or executed at all. So similar to the if-else statement, when I told you that either the if block or the else block will be executed, you're guaranteed that one of them will be executed. It's the same way here. In an if-else statement, one of the many blocks here will be executed. If all your conditions fail, so if the condition here under your if and all your else-if statements, if all of them evaluates to false, then eventually the block that is under the else statement is the one that is going to be executed. So in this particular example, we are guaranteed that one block of code will be executed. Another thing that I wanted to mention here, although it's quite obvious, is as you can see, the if statement, when you type if, this takes a condition. And that also applies to an else if statement. So every else if statement here, it also takes a condition. The only thing that doesn't take a condition is the else, because else is basically a catch-all kind of a thing. So if everything else fails, if all the other conditions evaluate to false, then the else block is going to be executed. So let's run this code in our Python editor and actually look at what the output will be. So if we say Python 3 and then the name of the program, we can see that C was printed out on the screen. Nothing else was printed, just C. And that's because 74 is greater than or equal to 70. What if we change the value here to be 91? As you expect, the answer is going to be A, because now this condition was evaluated to true, so this block was executed. What if, let's say we have a very bad student and he gets 1 out of 100. Now, if you want to print the output, of course, this student gets an F, which makes sense because all of these conditions here, all of the if conditions and your else if conditions, all of these were evaluated to false. That's why we go to the else block and then we print F. Okay, and this is the if, else statements. So to summarize, we talked in this video about if statements, what they're used for, why do we need them, and we talked about different variations of the if statements. We talked about if, we talked about if-else, and then we talked about if-else statements. These, like I said, are fundamental programming concepts that you will see in Python and all other programming languages as well. So make sure you understand them very well. Try to, do some practice, write code that uses if statements or if-else or if-else-if statements until you get the hang of it. Okay? And I'll see you in the next video.